Hey guys! Tonight we trudge into the grim, shadowy world of medieval assassins, the folks you probably won't survive to envy. Picture this damp alleyway slick with mud, chilly nights spent waiting for hours in utter silence, and weapons that feel less like deadly tools and more like awkward household objects. You might expect a life dripping with glamour and suspense. But nope, it's mostly boredom, sore muscles, and a lingering fear that your next step might be your last. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in a world where trust is scarce, and danger lurks in every shadow. Being a medieval assassin isn't about fancy daggers or cloak and dagger drama. It's about the grind, the relentless training, the long waits, and the paranoia that seeps into every moment. You probably imagine secret societies with elaborate plans and flawless executions, but the reality? You're more likely to trip over your own feet than deliver a clean kill. Historically, assassins in the Middle Ages were often hired blades working for kings, nobles, or even rebellious factions. Their work shaped politics and power in ways most people never realized. Yet, historians still argue whether these shadowy figures were glorified myths or just desperate men and women scraping by in brutal times. And then there's the curious fact that some assassins trained by meditating for hours, believing mental calm was as important as physical skill, though one has to wonder how well you can meditate with a dagger in your hand and your neck on the line. As you take your first tentative step into this unglamorous profession, brace yourself for a story full of sweat, failure, and just enough intrigue to keep you awake. Maybe. Now, imagine yourself slipping quietly down a narrow street, the stones beneath your feet slick with rain and grime. You're cold, your clothes damp and scratchy against your skin. Every shadow seems alive with unseen eyes. Your heart pounds, not from excitement but exhaustion, the kind only hours spent crouching in one spot can bring. The assassin's life was, in truth, more about patience than action. You might wait days, even weeks, for the right moment, often in squalid conditions. Unlike the movies, there's no dramatic music or slow-motion leaps, just a lot of silent, aching waiting, and the constant nagging fear that you've been spotted. Despite the grim conditions, there was a strange camaraderie among assassins. They were bound by a secret code, a blend of loyalty and suspicion that made trust a rare and precious commodity. You'd have allies, yes, but also rivals, ready to take your place at the first sign of weakness. And while many imagine the assassin's life as shrouded in mystery, historians still argue about how organized these groups truly were. Some think they were loosely connected bands. Others claim highly structured orders with rigid hierarchies. The truth is probably somewhere in between. A messy web of alliances, betrayals, and desperate survival. To close your first step into this shadowy world, remember the medieval assassin's life wasn't about glory. It was about enduring, adapting, and sometimes failing spectacularly. But despite it all, these shadows shaped history in ways you might never have guessed. Training trials, awkward and brutal. You wake up just as the first pale light leaks through the cracks in the stone walls, rubbing the sleep from your eyes only to remember that rest is a fleeting luxury. Your day begins not with a hearty breakfast or a warm fire, but with the hard reality of medieval assassin training, an exhausting blend of pain, awkwardness, and a constant test of your endurance and resolve. Picture yourself crawling through muddy ditches, your clothes heavy with wet earth, and your muscles screaming from yesterday's failed attempts to master silent movement. You're not just fighting external enemies. You're battling the exhaustion that creeps into your bones. the aching joints, and the blistered hands. The instructors bark orders, pushing you harder than you thought possible, punishing every slip with relentless scorn. Stealth is your most precious weapon, yet mastering it is anything but graceful. You balance on rickety rooftops, dodging loose tiles that threaten to betray your presence with a clatter. You practice climbing ropes so frayed and slippery that each ascent feels like a battle against gravity itself. And when you think it can't get worse, you're handed a mask heavy, itchy, and so badly crafted it fogs your vision and muffles your breathing. Some days involve strange rituals meant to steal your mind. You sit in a cold, dark cell, eyes closed, trying desperately to meditate despite the gnawing hunger and chill that bites through your skin. The belief is that a calm mind can wield a dagger as easily as a sword, though you wonder how many before you have given up, overwhelmed by fatigue and doubt. Training isn't just physical, it's psychological warfare. You endure isolation, sensory deprivation, and harsh discipline designed to break weak wills. Some recruits are forced to fast for days, to toughen their bodies and sharpen their senses, while others endure painful tests involving animal parts or bizarre concoctions thought to enhance alertness. Historians still debate the truth behind these stories, but there's no doubt that many trainees suffered through brutal ordeals. The strangest part: you learn to disguise yourself in outfits that are often impractical at best, ridiculous at worst. Imagine dressing as a merchant, lugging heavy sacks that restrict movement, or donning the robes of a monk, all while trying not to sneeze or stumble. These disguises are your first line of defense, and often your biggest liability, despite the agony. A few emerge from this crucible as skilled killers, ready to move from awkward trainee to deadly assassin. But for many, the harshness of training means a different fate quitting, breaking under pressure, or vanishing without a trace. As you wipe dirt and sweat from your face, you realize that this is only the beginning. The path ahead is long, lonely, and filled with challenges that test every fiber of your being. But if you survive, you'll gain a skill set feared by kings and whispered about in taverns, weapons of frustration. At last, you're introduced to the tools of your trade, the weapons you'll rely on to end lives swiftly and silently. But brace yourself, they're not the gleaming daggers or ornate swords you might picture. Instead, you get handed a frustrating assortment of battered blades, rusty knives, and other implements that look like they've seen better centuries. Your main dagger, for instance, is chipped and dull, its edge more suited for slicing bread than cutting throats. Gripping it feels awkward. The hilt is worn smooth from years of use by others who may not have been gentle. You practice stabbing at wooden dummies, only to find your blade slips or gets stuck. In a real fight, such flaws could be deadly, but then again, so could a single sneeze. The crossbow, a favorite among assassins, promises lethal precision, but comes with its own set of frustrations. It's bulky, slow to reload, and makes a loud thunk when fired, hardly ideal for stealth. You're taught to hide the noise with timing and distraction, but it's never quite perfect. And if the string snaps, you're left defenseless. Throwing knives are a cruel joke. They're light, awkward, and rarely fly true. Hours of practice often end with knives bouncing off targets or sticking uselessly in the dirt. You wonder how many assassins lost jobs because of a poorly thrown knife or an unexpected gust of wind. Then there's poison, the secret weapon of those who can't get close. Mixing toxic brews from herbs, minerals, and animal venom is a dark art passed down in whispers. Recipes are closely guarded, one wrong ingredient, and you risk killing yourself instead of your target. Applying poison is a waiting game, slow and nerve-wracking. Historians debate whether poison was widely used or mostly a last resort for desperate killers. Some assassins got creative, using weighted nets to entangle victims, or even training birds of prey to attack. While such stories sound like fantasy, they reveal the lengths to which killers would go. Yet, practical success was limited nets tangled themselves, and animals had minds of their own. Maintenance is another headache. Weapons need constant sharpening and cleaning, but resources are scarce. A dull blade is as dangerous to you as to your target. Carrying a full arsenal quietly is near impossible. You're juggling stealth with preparedness, often failing at both. In truth, you're less a master of arms and more a frustrated tinkerer, making do with what you can scavenge or steal. Your success depends less on your weapons and more on luck, cunning, and nerves of steel. The tedious wait, lurking, and boredom. You settle into your post, crouching in the damp shadows of a narrow alleyway. The smell of mold and rotting refuse thicken the air. Hours stretch before you like an endless gray road, each minute heavier than the last. You thought being an assassin meant action, quick strikes and fast escapes, but most of your time is spent waiting. Waiting, and more waiting. The cold bites through your threadbare cloak, chilling your bones as you try to stay as still as a statue. Your muscles cramp, your limbs numb, but you dare not shift too much lest the crunch of stone or rustle of fabric betray you. Every noise, a stray dog barking, a cart rolling by, a distant shout makes your heart leap, only to sink back into the dull ache of boredom. To pass the time, your mind drifts. You count cobblestones, track the movements of rats, rehearse your escape route over and over. You imagine the moment your target appears, the flash of steel, the gasp of surprise, but those moments are fleeting, rare as sunlight on a rainy day. Sleep, forget it. Closing your eyes is a gamble you can't afford. One brief lapse, one missed signal, and your entire mission could unravel. Your throat is parched, your stomach gnaws at itself, but you dare not move for water. The cold seeps deeper, and you envy the pigeons who flutter freely above the squalor. You try to steady your breathing, to calm the rising panic that this endless vigil brings. Some assassins whispered prayers to gods they barely believed in. Others simply tried to hold on to sanity by repeating mantras or counting silently. Historians still argue whether assassins were natural masters of patience or victims of cruel monotony. Either way, the waiting wears down even the toughest souls. The quiet is a poison almost as lethal as any blade. Occasionally, a fellow assassin might join you, their presence both comforting and risky. Conversations are whispered, filled with nervous laughter and tales of past failures, mostly their own. Of course. Sometimes you share meager rations, a rare kindness in a brutal world. As darkness falls and the city's lights flicker on, you remain fixed in your spot, muscles stiff and senses strained. You wonder how many assassins before you have stared into this same void, waiting for a moment that may never come. Despite the drudgery, you know this patience is your only weapon now. One slip, one missed moment of stillness, and the shadows will swallow you whole. Fashion disasters of medieval killers. You might picture the medieval assassin cloaked in sleek black garments, gliding silently through the night like a shadow. The reality far from it. Instead, your wardrobe is a maddening mix of ill-fitting armor, scratchy fabrics, and disguises that seem more likely to betray you than protect you. If fashion was a weapon, you'd be disarmed before you even drew your dagger. Take chainmail, for instance. Sure, it offers some protection, but it's heavy, noisy, and stiff. The constant clinking of metal links is about as subtle as a bull in a china shop. Hardly the ideal outfit for someone who needs to move unseen. Leather armor might be quieter, but it's thick and hot, making every movement sluggish and sweaty, and the boots clunky, rigid, and with soles worn unevenly from miles of trekking over stone streets. Disguises, oh, the disguises. You're expected to blend into crowds by dressing as everything from monks to merchants, nobles to beggars, but often, these costumes are a bad joke. Imagine squeezing into a merchant's cloak that's 2 sizes too large, or sporting a wig that itches like crazy and makes you look like a bad caricature of nobility. Trying to imitate a monk's mannerisms without years of practice. Good luck with that. The awkward robes you wear smell faintly of mold and smoke, thanks to weeks spent in damp hideouts. Hygiene isn't a priority when you're running from guards or hiding in cesspits. Sweating in heavy layers, covered in grime. You're more likely to attract attention for all the wrong reasons. The stench doesn't help either. Medieval towns weren't exactly known for cleanliness, and neither were their assassins. If you thought smelling bad was a minor inconvenience, try sneaking past your target when you resemble a walking sewer. Some assassins tried to mitigate these fashion fails by layering scents or rubbing herbs on their skin. But historians still debate how effective these methods were, or if they just added to the bizarre aromas. And yet, despite all these obstacles, your clothing is your first and often only line of defense. Choosing your outfit might mean the difference between life and death, even if it comes at the cost of comfort and dignity. It's a strange paradox. Your success depends on blending in. But the very tools to do so often make you stand out like a sore thumb. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval assassin fashion, the messy hunt for targets. So, you've survived training and dressed yourself in a questionable disguise. Now comes the part you might imagine as a sleek, silent stalk through dark corridors, but no, it's a messy, awkward, and often humiliating hunt through the tangled streets and crowded marketplaces of medieval towns. Your target isn't some oblivious noble standing alone in a moonlit garden. They're surrounded by guards, servants, and nosy townsfolk. Following them means weaving through bustling crowds without attracting a single suspicious glance. A task easier said than done when your boots thud like a herd of cows and your cloak catches on every passing cart. Gathering intelligence is no less complicated. You might bribe a servant for information, eavesdrop on whispered conversations in noisy taverns, or sneak into locked rooms to steal letters. But each of these acts carries the risk of discovery. One careless word from a nervous informant or a misplaced footstep can alert the wrong person, turning your carefully laid plans into a nightmare. Trust is a fragile currency in this world. You rely on local contacts who might be loyal or they might be double agents, eager to hand you over for a reward. You learn to question every tip and doubt every ally, which only adds to your paranoia. Historians still debate the sophistication of medieval spy networks. Were assassins part of organized cells with intricate plans, or did they mostly work as lone wolves improvising on the fly? Probably a bit of both, depending on time and place. The stalking itself is rife with awkward moments. You duck behind carts, cringe as your breathing echoes too loudly, and pray that the stray dog that just appeared doesn't start barking at the worst possible moment. You might accidentally bump into a passerby or sneeze just as your target turns around, forcing you into a clumsy retreat. And sometimes, after all this effort, the target simply doesn't appear. Plans are foiled by unexpected schedule changes or last-minute travels, leaving you to wonder if all this waiting and sneaking was for nothing. Despite the frustrations, every successful assassination begins with this messy, imperfect hunt, a testament to patience, persistence, and a healthy dose of luck. Clumsy kills and botched attempts. After all the waiting, the training, and the stalking, you finally get your chance. But hold your breath because history shows that the kill rarely goes as smoothly as you imagined. The medieval assassin's life is littered with stories of botched attempts and spectacular failures that make you wonder how any of them survived long enough to retire. Imagine lunging at your target only to have your dagger glance off a thick leather jerkin, sending you stumbling backward in a flurry of embarrassment and panic. Or worse, picture the moment your blade snaps in half mid-strike, leaving you defenseless and scrambling for an escape route as guards swarm in. There's the tale of one assassin who, overwhelmed by stress and fatigue, fainted just before delivering the fatal blow. Others froze in terror or hesitated, giving their victims time to fight back or flee. It turns out, being a killer under pressure isn't as easy as the movies make it seem. The consequences of failure were severe. Capture meant torture, public humiliation, or execution, often in the most gruesome ways imaginable. The constant threat of death added a crushing weight to every mission, making nerves and shaky hands deadly foes. Sometimes, the assassin's plans were undone by simple bad luck, a loose cobblestone, an unexpected scream, or a drunken reveler wandering into the wrong alley. You develop a healthy fear of anything unpredictable, especially weather, which could ruin carefully planned escapes. Despite the high stakes and frequent failures, some assassins manage to pull off their missions with lethal precision. But those successful strikes often overshadow the countless near disasters and flubbed attempts that pepper the historical record. These stories remind us that assassins were human, flawed, anxious, and often terrified, far from the infallible shadows of legend. They were kids fumbling through a deadly school play, hoping to make it through the curtain call. Historians still debate the accuracy of these tales. Were these failures as common as stories suggest, or were they exaggerated to entertain and caution? Either way, the truth is far messier than the slick assassins of fiction. The lonely, paranoid mind. After so many close calls and long nights in the shadows, your mind starts playing tricks on you. Paranoia creeps in like a cold fog, wrapping tight around your thoughts until every whisper sounds like a betrayal, and every shadow hides a threat. You trust no one, not your closest allies. Not the streets you once knew. Not even your own reflection. Your sleep becomes shallow and restless. Every noise, no matter how faint a creaking door, a distant footstep jolts you awake. You find yourself checking over your shoulder constantly, heart racing at the slightest hint of movement. The world feels like a minefield where one wrong step means death. Isolation tightens its grip. Relationships are scarce and fraught with danger. A moment of vulnerability could mean exposure or worse. You become a ghost, drifting between places and people without leaving a trace of your true self. This psychological toll was no small matter. Historians argue whether medieval assassins suffered from unique mental conditions born of their profession, or if their experiences mirrored common fears, only intensified by constant threat. Either way, the loneliness and dread shaped their lives as much as the blade in their hand. Sometimes, assassins tried to soothe their frayed nerves with religion, prayer, or meditation, seeking comfort in the divine amid chaos. Others turned to alcohol or dark humor to dull the edges of their fear. But the weight never fully lifted. Living in constant danger warps your sense of reality. You might mistake friend for foe, or imagine enemies where there are none. This mental strain made many assassins unstable, their minds fraying as surely as their bodies. Yet, even with the crushing loneliness, some found moments of camaraderie with fellow killers, brief respites in an otherwise grim existence. But trust was always a gamble, and betrayal lurked just beneath the surface. Your mind becomes a battleground, as treacherous as any physical fight. And in this shadowy war, victory means survival, even if at the cost of your sanity. Rival assassins and deadly betrayals In the shadowed world you inhabit, you soon discover you are never truly alone. Other assassins lurk nearby, and not all of them are friendly. Rivalry in your line of work isn't just a passing annoyance. It's a deadly game of survival. You quickly learn that your greatest threat might come not from your target, but from someone lurking just as deep in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. The assassin's community is fractured and fraught with jealousy. Contracts are limited, and competition for the highest-paying or most prestigious jobs is fierce. You watch your back constantly, aware that a dagger in the dark might come from a fellow killer rather than a soldier or guard. Betrayal is the currency of this hidden economy. Loyalties shift like shadows. Alliances form and break overnight. An ally today might be a snitch or rival assassin tomorrow, ready to sell you out for a coin or a favor. Trust is a luxury few can afford. There are tales of assassins setting traps not just for their targets, but for each other. Secret plots to eliminate rivals before they could poach a contract or gain favor with a powerful patron are whispered among surviving killers. Sometimes these rivalries erupted into open conflict. Violent skirmishes fought in alleys and taverns. Historians debate how organized these rivalries really were. Some argue they were chaotic and personal, the desperate brawls of mercenaries trying to survive. Others suggest a more calculated power struggle, with assassins working for competing factions or noble houses, each vying for control over the shadowy underworld. You realize the profession is not only a battle against your targets, but a constant war among peers. The knife in your hand is as likely to be used against you as your mark. This world of rival assassins teaches harsh lessons about trust, loyalty, and survival in the brutal economy of death. You learn that sometimes. The most dangerous enemy is the one who smiles at you in the tavern before stabbing you in the back. Assassination disasters. Despite careful planning, not all assassination attempts end with a swift, silent kill. Sometimes, they explode literally or figuratively in the worst possible way. You might think you've covered every angle, but history is littered with tales of disasters that turned deadly missions into public fiascos. Imagine preparing a bomb meant to eliminate a corrupt lord, only for it to detonate prematurely in a crowded marketplace, causing panic, destruction, and innocent casualties. The ensuing chaos alerts guards and townsfolk alike, turning the assassin into the hunted overnight. Such explosive failures not only jeopardized the mission, but often worsened the political situation they aimed to fix. Poisons, too, had their risks. A carefully prepared toxin might fail to work. Or worse, accidentally poison the assassin or an innocent bystander. There are accounts of assassins dying from their own concoctions, victims of their deadly art's unpredictability. Sometimes, plans unraveled when simple human error intervened, a missed signal, an unexpected route change by the target, or the sudden appearance of an ally saved from execution could foil even the most meticulously arranged ambush. These botched attempts were more than embarrassing. They were fatal. The failed assassin faced brutal punishment torture, public execution, or a lifetime in prison. Such disasters could also bring ruin to their employers, damaging reputations and inciting retaliations. Historians still debate how frequent these spectacular failures were. Some suggest they were rare but memorable exceptions, while others believe the medieval assassin's life was one long series of close calls and near misses. What's clear is that the line between success and catastrophe was thin, and the cost of error high. You learn that even the best-laid plans can collapse into chaos. And sometimes, surviving the disaster is as much a victory as completing the mission. No happy endings. The assassin's life rarely ends with a triumphant return or a quiet retirement in a distant village. Instead, you find that most of your predecessors met grim fates: imprisonment, exile, or death. the shadows you've mastered offer little refuge once your usefulness fades. Many assassins were betrayed by the very patrons who hired them. Once a contract was fulfilled or a rival eliminated, their employers often discarded them like worn-out tools. Loyalty was a one-way street, and gratitude was in short supply. Captured assassins faced brutal interrogations. Torture chambers awaited those unlucky enough to be caught, where confessions were wrung out with instruments designed to make men, and sometimes women, bitterly regret their choices. Even those who escaped execution often lived with scars, both physical and mental, that haunted their remaining days. Exile was a common alternative. Cast out from the cities and courts they once served, many assassins wandered as outcasts, forced to survive in harsh wilderness or the company of other criminals. Some turned to banditry or mercenary work, trading one brutal life for another. Few managed to find peace or wealth. The assassin's trade was thankless, and the price paid was steep. Tales of assassins retiring comfortably are rare, and often steeped in myth or exaggeration. Historians debate the percentage of assassins who escaped such fates. Did any truly retire, or was every ending marred by tragedy? The truth is lost in the shadows of time, but the odds certainly were not in their favor. As you reflect on this, the cold reality sinks in. The assassin's life is one of constant danger, betrayal, and uncertainty. There are no guarantees, no happy endings, only survival, for as long as fate allows. Women in the shadows. You might think assassins were exclusively men lurking in dark corners, but the medieval world tells a more complicated story. Women, often overlooked or erased from the historical record, played surprisingly significant roles in the assassin's underworld. Far from mere bystanders, many served as spies, informants, and even deadly killers in their own right. Imagine a woman disguised as a servant or merchant, moving through the bustling market with ease. She gathers secrets whispered behind closed doors, slips poison into goblets unnoticed, or sends messages hidden in plain sight. The very fact that she is underestimated by those around her becomes her greatest weapon. Some legends speak of female assassins whose skills rivaled or surpassed those of their male counterparts. They used charm, cunning, and a deep understanding of human nature to accomplish tasks that brute force couldn't. Their methods were often subtle and indirect, relying on deception and patience. Yet, historians still debate the extent of women's involvement. Due to scant documentation, much of what we know comes from folklore, oral traditions, or biased chroniclers who either exaggerated or dismissed their contributions. Was the female assassin a common figure or an exceptional anomaly? What's clear is that women had unique access and opportunities within medieval societies, enabling them to influence events from behind the scenes. Their stories add depth to the shadowy world of assassination, revealing it as not just a man's game, but a complex network of players. As you consider this, it's worth remembering that the medieval assassin's world was more nuanced than popular imagination suggests, shaped by a diverse cast of characters, each with their own skills, motives, and stories. Legends versus reality. When you think of medieval assassins, Hollywood images probably come to mind: slick figures in dark cloaks, moving silently through moonlit castles, executing flawless kills without a hitch. But as you step deeper into their true world, the sharp contrast between legend and reality becomes glaringly obvious. The romanticized version paints assassins as near mythical beings, masters of stealth and precision, operating within secret societies bound by honor and discipline. In truth, many were far from perfect. They were often desperate, clumsy, and driven more by survival than ideology. Consider the countless botched missions, the missed marks, the petty rivalries, and the sometimes ridiculous disguises. These less glamorous details rarely make it into tales told by chroniclers or the silver screen, but are crucial to understanding the real hardships faced by these shadowy figures. Stories of assassin brotherhoods, like the famed Order of Assassins in the Middle East, blur the lines between fact and myth. Historians debate how organized and influential these groups truly were. Some argue they were tightly knit sects with religious fervor, while others see them as loosely connected bands of opportunists. Similarly, tales of mystical training, poisons with magical properties, or secret codes are often exaggerated. While some elements hold truth, much of it is embellished to create a compelling narrative, feeding both fear and fascination. The truth is messier and more human. Medieval assassins were people flawed, fearful, and sometimes even unlucky. Their lives were filled with drudgery and failure, alongside moments of success. Understanding this helps dispel the glamour and exposes the brutal reality of a thankless profession that shaped history quietly and often chaotically. The end of an era. As the medieval world shifted, so too did the fate of assassins. The rise of centralized governments, professional armies, and new technologies slowly but surely pushed the shadowy trade into obsolescence. You stand at the crossroads of history, watching the curtain close on a brutal chapter. Gunpowder changed everything. The noisy, chaotic battlefields it created left little room for the silent killer. Crossbows and daggers gave way to firearms with deadly range and devastating impact. No longer could a lone assassin rely on stealth alone. Armies and guards became more organized, their vigilance sharpened. Centralized law enforcement began to assert control over cities and kingdoms. Patrols increased, punishments grew harsher, and surveillance tightened. The once wild, anarchic streets where assassins thrived became more controlled spaces, making clandestine operations far riskier. Assassination didn't disappear overnight, but it evolved. The lone medieval assassin faded, replaced by more formalized espionage, political intrigue, and diplomatic maneuvering. The craft moved indoors into palaces and courtrooms rather than alleys and marketplaces. Historians debate the pace and causes of this decline. Some argue it was a swift collapse driven by technological leaps and state power. Others see a gradual transformation, with assassins adapting to changing times before eventually being outmatched. Whatever the case, the brutal, shadowy world of medieval assassination became a thing of the past, remembered mostly in grim stories and romanticized myths. As the era ends, you reflect on the complex forces that swept these killers from the streets, marking a shift in how power and violence were wielded. What the miserable lives teach us. Looking back on the grim, often miserable lives of medieval assassins, you realize these shadows teach us much about power, fear, and human folly. They weren't heroes or villains in neat packages, but complex individuals caught in brutal times, trying to survive with limited choices. Their stories remind us that history isn't just shaped by kings and battles, but by those lurking unseen, whose actions rippled quietly but profoundly through time. Despite their frequent failures, betrayals, and loneliness, assassins altered political landscapes, toppled rulers, and shifted the course of events. These unglamorous lives reveal the harsh costs of violence not just to victims, but to perpetrators, who bore immense psychological and physical burdens. The constant paranoia, isolation, and fear shaped their identities as much as any skill with a blade. Their tales warn us about the price of wielding power through fear and secrecy, highlighting the fragility of trust and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Perhaps most importantly, they offer lessons in humility. The assassin's existence was precarious, marked by failure as often as success. showing that even the deadliest can fall prey to circumstance, error, and fate. As you close this chapter on medieval assassins, you might find a strange kinship with these unluckiest killers-survivors of a harsh world, shadows among shadows, and reminders that history's darkest corners hold stories worth telling. As we gently draw the curtain on the shadowy world of medieval assassins, the harsh realities begin to soften like the fading glow of a dying candle. The damp alleys, the biting cold, and the ever-present fear dissolve into whispers of history, quiet echoes of lives lived in the margins. These were not heroes cloaked in glory, but weary souls navigating a brutal existence, often forgotten by the histories they helped shape. Their stories speak of resilience in the face of despair, of survival amid chaos, and of the complex dance between power and vulnerability that defines us all. So, as you settle into the quiet of the night, let these tales remind you that history's shadows are not empty, but filled with lessons about fear, ambition, and the cost of violence. Maybe next time you think of those silent killers, you'll see not just the swift blade, but also the human heart behind it. Now, take a deep breath. Let the tension slip away and sink gently into sleep. Sweet dreams.